a lot of times folks want their attorney to step in and represent them, in an apparent way, meaning I'm standing there for you, Max and Dylan, and I'm going to argue your case, and I'm going to stand up for your position and your rights, and we're going to prevail. But what I found with FAA matters is if you have that opportunity really just to talk with somebody and talk it through, at least from my experience, most of the time I coach pilots just to respond to the FAA directly and talk it out with the FAA. I talk it out with a pilot. Then they talk it out with the FAA. I never apparently enter the picture at all. And that's strategic. And one of the reasons for that is because if I say, hey, FAA, I'm representing Max and Dylan, well, that escalates the formality of what's being discussed immediately. And then it has to go to the FAA legal level, and then it's going to receive significantly more scrutiny than if you just talk it out with the inspector.
Sex, seniority, and salary in that order.
Back on. You're on 121.5, the emergency frequency.
It's a show by professional pilots for professional pilots.
I looked back at them and I said, I don't think we're at the right airport. And they go, I don't think we are either.
Each episode, we bring you fascinating conversations with industry experts.
I think I should be a go-to on how to deal with 63, 64-year-old men.
You're going to chase it like a dog chasing a school bus.
But we're not just about the serious stuff. We're here to have fun.
And I like to sit with pilots a lot of times. I always say they're better looking than Tom Cruise.
It's a whole thing.
The 21.5 Professional Pilots Podcast is your destination for everything aviation, whether you're cruising in the flight levels or just starting your journey.
All right, guys, we are very excited on this episode to have Forrest Owens, who is an attorney, an aviation legal counsel for the law office of Forrest Owens. And we are excited to talk about legal matters in aviation. Welcome to the show, Forrest.
Thank you, Dylan and Max, for having me. We're gonna have a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah. More fun than some of your clients probably.
Clients have fun. The clients have fun. They fly too. So, as you know, the old saying goes that when the weight of the paperwork equals the weight of the plane, then you're ready to fly. So,
that's funny. I actually haven't heard that, but legal stuff in aviation is everywhere, obviously. And as pilots, I think you can skin this cat a lot of different ways. But the one that we're always, I think, pushed to the back of our minds, but is always apparent is if you have any legal trouble with the FAA. And so I think a lot of people, they don't really want to talk about it. They don't really want to think about it until something happens, and all of a sudden it's all they think about. So one of the things that I was wondering is how you handle issues like that. But before we get there, Forrest, let's talk about you a little bit. What's your background? How did you get to specialize in aviation law and those sort of things?
Well, I got to specialize in aviation law because I realized pretty quickly that nobody likes the federal aviation regulations. So I found this out while I was going through school to be an A&P mechanic, and all my classmates didn't like our class in federal aviation regulations. I did, and so I thought it might, and then I got intrigued by it. And then I ended up working for other companies along the way in their aviation companies, their contracts departments, and ultimately went to law school and have been focused on and specializing in aviation-related legal matters since 2006. So scarily, almost 20 years now. But that's, aviation is kind of one of those things that seems to run in families. So my dad was an FAA inspector for approximately 25 years.
No way.
So I was exposed to aviation in that way as well. And then my grandfather flew. I had a Luscombe also. I'm a private pilot as well, but I admit that all I fly these days is paper planes. That seems to take up most of my time. So, but but going back to your question, we can dive into that. But there's, the FAA is, FAA. You're going to have to deal with the FAA if you're a certified pilot or air person or airman, whatever the nomenclature may be at the present time.
So from that perspective, if something, let's just start there because I'm sure that's what everyone's thinking first. So we've all heard on the radio, advise when ready to copy down a phone number for possible pilot deviation, right? And you say, okay, Roger, yeah, and your voice is shaky, and you copy down the number, and you land. I know, like, as an airline pilot, we are told not to call the number, for sure, and we turn it over to, our chief pilot's office, and we have an ATC intermediary, and they just kind of, like, handle it. You as the pilot don't do anything. But if you're don't have that kind of support, what do you do?
Well, I like to think about it kind of like in emergency situations, or when that old stop, think, and act. You got to stop first. You got to think about what you're going to do, then take action. One of the things that pilots do that kind of gets them in trouble is that most of us, now there's always outliers, but most pilots are inclined to comply with the rules. You're inclined to follow them. You're trained to do that. You're geared towards doing the right thing, and in the interest of safety. But if you're presented with that situation, you often want to have this knee-jerk reaction of trying to solve the problem as fast as you can. And that's not a good approach. You've got to take a step back and think about it. So I think what's commonly known as the Brasher warning, when you get that notification from the tower to copy down a number and call when you land, make that phone call. Copy down the number. Try to assess the situation on your own. Take some notes. And if it's in a private pilot circumstance, call your attorney, or call a friend, or call somebody. I mean, you could call, your CFI, ask them. It wouldn't be a bad idea to run the scenario past somebody to see what you've actually done or what you could expect. Most of the time, it's an altitude bust or a failure to follow air traffic control instructions, or something along those lines. And the severity of it's not really going to be known to you when you first pick up the phone. And even when you do call, you can give, you can give your identifying information. That doesn't hurt. But if questions are posed to you that are more investigative in nature, then, slow down and ask for those questions to be provided to you in writing so you can analyze your own response. Most of the time you can handle these things with that, as long as you say the right thing. Certainly sometimes things happen that are really, outside the pale, or they're, you really did something really screwed up. But most of the time that's not the case. Most of the time it's something a little bit more benign than that.
So do a lot of times those phone calls, more often than not, are you saying, turn into just a pilot educational phone call or whatever, and then nothing happens?
Yeah, they can. And fortunately, the FAA's culture has changed probably for the better in the past 10 years. Some people would argue and say that's not true, but around 2015 or 2016, the FAA came out with what's called the compliance philosophy. It started as a compliance philosophy and then became a compliance program. And I can tell you, having dealt with airman issues before and after that it dramatically changed the way that the FAA interacted with pilots. Before, say, 2015, if you busted a TFR or had an issue, it would almost certainly result in a notice of proposed certificate action, and you would have to deal with it. You'd have to deal with a conference with the FAA and FAA inspector, the FAA attorney, and go through a much more formal route. Once that compliance philosophy kicked in along with the compliance program, most of the time, as long as it's not egregious, most of the time things are handled with a phone call. And, I can talk about that too, because this is kind of goes to my own approach with these particular circumstances is, a lot of times folks want their attorney to step in and represent them, in an apparent way, meaning I'm standing there for you, Max and Dylan, and I'm going to argue your case, and I'm going to stand up for your position and your rights, and we're going to prevail. But what I found with FAA matters is if you have that opportunity really just to talk with somebody and talk it through, at least from my experience, most of the time I coach pilots just to respond to the FAA directly and talk it out with the FAA. We talk it, I talk it out with a pilot. Then they talk it out with the FAA. I never apparently enter the picture at all. And that's strategic. And one of the reasons for that is because if I say, hey, FAA, I'm representing Max and Dylan, well, that escalates the formality of what's being discussed immediately. And then it has to go to the FAA legal level, and then it's going to receive significantly more scrutiny than if you just talk it out with the inspector.
That's interesting. I wasn't expecting that, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, because you just kind of coach them and say, hey, make sure you don't say this. And if they start going down this road, then that's when you stop.
Yeah,
but
correct.
Here's where you can operate in this. And which is, and you make a point too. It's like when air traffic control tells you to do something, we are programmed to do it all the time. And so like when they tell you to call the number and it's just kind of like, that's what we do. But I had a kind of interesting story, but this had to have been back in, let's see, 2003 or something, probably, when I was a new flight instructor. Flew down to Phoenix to an outlying airport. We're there for a little bit, and I took off and I turned kind of towards the Phoenix airport, so into the airspace as it comes down lower and lower, and obtaining a clearance to Class B airspace to go through it to the north. And I taught, and this was before iPads and stuff, dude. We had a chart out. I had the DME tuned up. There's no fall in the airplane on the screen, kids. And so anyway, I call Phoenix Approach, blah blah, and they said, hey, copy down this number and give us a call. I don't think they said the word pilot deviation back then, or they didn't to me. But I remember I was like, dude, I had to ask them like 3 times because I was freaking out, like trying to copy it down, again.
Your
on
hands
a piece of paper.
shaking. Your hands are
totally,
shaking.
dude.
Yeah.
I was freaking out. And so I was flying back to Prescott. So the whole flight, I'm like, oh my God. And so I land and I call, didn't even think, the thought didn't even occur to me not to call. Like I was just like, oh, he told me to call. I'm going to call. And they called, and I violated the Class B airspace, and the guy was really cool. And I was obviously apologetic, and probably was completely admitted fault and everything I shouldn't have done. And then they just said, we're just going to call this a pilot educational phone call. Just be more careful next time. Maybe turn away from the Phoenix airport while you obtain your clearance to Class B airspace. That way you don't run into, back yourself into a corner. And I said, okay, thanks. And that was the last I heard of it. But so, and that's the only time I think I've ever had to copy a number and call air traffic control, but I was freaked out and I did not know what to do.
As you would be anticipated to be freaked out. That's the natural, your pulse is going to quicken. You're suddenly going to start to feel your heartbeat in your neck, and hands are going to shake. And, most, non-pilots can sympathize that, or maybe we all can sympathize with it on a more routine basis when you see the red and blue flashing lights behind you when you're driving, and you think to yourself, I might know why I'm being pulled over, but I might not. And they always tend to come at you with, why I pulled you over? And the answer is usually, no, not really. Can you tell me why you pulled me over? That's same thing with the FAA. And it's a good thing that Max, it's good that the inspector that you dealt with was kind of a version of the kinder, gentler FAA. There's always, everybody's got different personalities, so every FAA inspector is going to be different. And sometimes they're going to be more educational in their approach versus enforcement minded. But I can honestly say that, since 2015 timeframe when the compliance program, compliance philosophy came in, it's gotten so much better. At least, it's taken away all that work and all those hearings that occurred prior to then, but it's a lot better for pilots, and I think it's a lot more efficient overall.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And I feel like too, if you get told by air traffic control to copy down a phone number, it's usually something you did inadvertently, like it was an accident. You accidentally, the altitude hold came off or whatever, something like that. You obviously weren't intended to do because you knew you were being watched and blah, blah. And then I feel like there's the flip side where you did something and somebody either reported you from your tail number visually or they pulled you up on ADS-B and said, hey, this guy was flying too close to my house or whatever. So there's that, like this other scenario, I feel like, and I've heard about people just then getting a phone call from an inspector saying, hey, were you flying November whatever on this date at this time in this area? Or is that kind of the other way this goes? And can you talk about
that's
that?
the other way that it goes. And when you get those calls, you could say, just why don't you put those questions down in writing? I've got a review. I don't have a firm recollection with regards to what occurred that day, which is almost always going to be, that's a true statement. You're not going to have a firm recollection of exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Especially when you're called out of the blue. So you're being honest. I don't have a firm recollection.
Would it be bad to say, let me refer to the ASAP report I submitted in that matter to check the date and time?
Probably not. But that brings up another thing. If you do have those occurrences, what's commonly known as the NASA report, it's a good idea to fill that out so that you have a basis for excusal with regards to civil penalties, which is what the NASA report does. So you can fill that out online. But caution I would have in that regard is that, if you have a crash or you have an occurrence where there's personal injury involved, think twice about that NASA report and be careful with that, because you can make statements against your interest that could be used against you later in civil litigation. So
that's interesting. So those are available for civil litigation. There's no some privacy protection or
those can be for example, if crash, burn, die lawsuit, the lawsuits that occur after that with regards to injury, those could potentially be used as statements of admission, whereas in the purely regulatory standpoint from pilot deviations, those types of things, they can be used for your benefit. But if it crosses that line of somebody's hurt, you need to think about what you're going to put in there. And that goes back to, again, talking with somebody, making sure that what you say is what you want to say under those circumstances. So you got to be careful. So, there's always, we all want to know, hey, what's the rule? Hey, what do we do? What are the marching orders I have so that I can comply and just keep on keeping on without thinking about it anymore? And that's just not the way things work. You always kind of have to have your eye on the ball, just like when you're flying, weather changes, things come up. You're always adjusting and adapting. And the same thing goes with when you're dealing with the FAA and those inquiries. You're constantly updating your approach.
So really, I guess at the end of the day, you want to, at the very least, receive some coaching, but you do want to respond. Ignoring it is certainly not going to make things go away.
No, that's not a good idea either. You want to be compliant, and you want to be forthright with regards to what's being asked of you, and you do want to resolve it. But again, the problem is if you try to resolve it too quickly and answer it, if you over answer a question, you haven't done yourself a good service there.
Let's take a quick time out from our conversation to talk about our favorite product of 2025, and that is Amigo Aerotows T1. If you listen to our recent conversation with them, it has changed Max's life at the airport. No longer is he struggling to push that 2,000-pound airplane in and out of the hangar. Simply hooks up the T1 now and effortlessly moves that airplane back and forth. If you want to get more information, check out the link in the show notes for AeroTow's website. They have a tow that'll accommodate up to 15,000 pounds. And they've got a special offer for our listeners. Use checkout code 21FIVE to get $100 off any product. Scroll down on your podcast app to find the link to AeroTow and check out all of the products they have for pilots. Okay, back to the show.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot of like when you're doing the oral portion of a check ride.
Yeah,
and you can either answer the question, concisely, or some people just have this like verbal diarrhea where they're just and
Forrest, have you ever had a client, you talk to him on the phone, and then you're like, yeah, maybe it's better if I handle the communications here. Like you sort of can feel that out.
Yeah, sometimes, but again, that goes back to, I think the thing is it goes back to the initial emotional response that you have when you get that call.
Yep.
Your pulse pounds, your hands sweat, you shake. I think if you take time to talk about it with somebody, I haven't met or I haven't had too many clients that couldn't be coached through talking with the FAA. It's just a matter of that initial gut response of wanting to solve things and being emotional about it. It's like, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. I was fully compliant with the rules. Well, you don't really know what they're coming at you at with sometimes. I mean, there's certain circumstances where that call comes later, and then you do a little investigation and you listen to the ATC tapes because you get those. You get those from the FAA because usually there is some dialogue that, maintain flight level 30, etc. And you didn't maintain that flight level, or you find out that there was a deviation, then you have a radar track there too. So you get all that information. I can get the same information, maybe not all of it, but I can get the FAA's investigative file if it really gets serious and see a lot of that information and see what occurred. It kind of, goes both ways, but there was to kind of differentiate there too. If you're operating in a non-commercial Part 91 environment, you need to, you talk to your attorney or talk to somebody. But if you're a professional pilot, you need to defer to your chief pilot. You need to defer to the protocol within your company for responding to those. Fortunately, in the commercial world, you've got a lot more protection and probably a lot more training on how to deal with those circumstances appropriately than pilots flying in a private study.
Yes and no, I would say. And that actually leads me to the next question I had for you. So for some of us, some of our listeners, yes, they're airline pilots. We've got unions. We have ASAP programs. We have a lot of help. And then there are others that maybe are at a 135 company. And like you said, maybe you've got a chief pilot and you have still some infrastructure. But then there are a lot of folks like me and that just fly a Part 91 airplane. 2 pilots, that's the flight department. And I was curious, one, when we don't have a lot of infrastructure around us, what are some things that we can do to protect us? And 2, I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the liability that we carry as pilots. So I would say number 1, AOPA legal services or something like that. Is that if you're just flying a jet or a private jet around Part 91, is that something worth investing in, or are you better off just having a good relationship with an aviation attorney? Like, what are some ways that you can protect yourself when you don't have a lot of infrastructure at your company?
Well, if you don't have a lot of infrastructure with your company, AOPA Legal Services and that program is a really good one. And I'm not pitching it, but I am an AOPA panel attorney. So I do get referred matters from AOPA. But the cost is nominal to be a member on an annual basis to receive that. And you do get, you get significant cover. You can consult with them almost about anything. Just call up, and they have a number of attorneys on staff in Maryland. That's where they're headquartered, that you can speak with about unique circumstances. And given the volume of inquiries that they receive, they should be able to help you out. So to your point, if you're flying Part 91 in a I presume you're flying Part 91 in a corporate setting.
Yeah.
Yeah. AOPA is a good option to help provide that support in the event that you do get a call that you wouldn't otherwise have. You know, you don't have a union, or you don't have protocol like an air carrier would.
Right.
Wow, it's actually really reasonable. Like, I just pulled it up; it's $189, and that's for pilots with ATP commercial flight instructors.
Yeah,
for like
that's
up to 20 hours of attorney representation, 50 hours appeal to NTSB judge. I mean, it's pretty.
Yep.
Yeah, the 20 hours will cost you a lot more than $189. That's for sure.
Yes.
The first 20 minutes will cost you more than $189. So,
well, maybe not, but yeah, the value is there, especially on airman enforcement matters, or where you're dealing with the notice of proposed certificate action. It's a deal, and I don't think any active pilot that flies regularly should be flying without that support, because I have represented airmen via AOPA when they're paying me to represent pilots for that 20 hours, and it's pilots coming out way ahead.
I mean, you can even
from
pay
a monetary
monthly,
perspective,
$18 a month. Like, set it and forget it. That's
finance.
And you'll get
that's less than you pay for Netflix, folks.
Yeah, that's a no-brainer. So on the second half of my question, Forrest, this is something that I don't think we've talked to aviation attorneys about enough. Violations, calls from inspectors. Yeah, we kind of get that, but no one really ever talks about the civil side and the liabilities that we carry. And you mentioned earlier, what happens if somebody gets hurt and you're a crew member flying the plane? Yeah, maybe you filed a NASA report, and maybe from an FAA standpoint, you might be covered, but that doesn't mean that that's all that's going to happen, right? So could you maybe talk to us a little bit about, maybe first explain for anyone that doesn't know the civil side, what that even means, and what liabilities you carry as a crew member, and like what are some scenarios that could be possible if something bad happens to you?
Well, the civil side is it's not criminal, meaning usually somebody's hurt or some monetary loss has occurred, or damage to an aircraft has occurred. Something that costs somebody money is usually is what falls in the civil realm. With regards to the liability of a pilot, most of the responsibility is always going to shade towards the pilot. So as a pilot, you're in the crosshairs of liability all the time. And the target of liability is always going to be on your back in some way, shape, or form. Candidly, the one thing that most pilots have going for them is that they don't have enough money to be a target in civil litigation, because if even with the judgment, you don't have the money to pay. And if a judgment makes it that far, or civil litigation ensues, you'll ultimately declare bankruptcy, which is not something you want to do either. So all those things, none of those things sound good, right? None of them sound good. If you follow the rules or follow protocol, you'll minimize liability. However, my suggestion would be, if you're flying Part 91, or particularly if you're flying Part 91, or if you're flying even 135 for a charter operator, politely, delicately ask for a copy of the insurance policy that they have that's associated with your activity, because they'll have coverage, and you'll be able to see the terms of their coverage and review those. Just see what they are, see what the liability limits are associated with the coverage, to see where you fall in that mix. Because I can tell you that under some circumstances, to your point, Dylan, Part 91 operators, especially now, a lot of Part 91 operators really don't carry a lot of insurance. They'll cover insurance to cover the hull for whatever that may be worth. And then they'll carry liability insurance, but the liability insurance may not be as much as you think. And it may not cover you as a pilot in the way you hope. So take a look at that just to see where you're at in that, and you may want to request, say, I'm not really comfortable with these terms of coverage. Can we talk with the broker and see about adjusting that? I mean, those things certainly make sense, and they're certainly not unreasonable asks, because it's your livelihood that's on the line in a lot of circumstances. And you're also personally on the hook you could be personally on the hook for certain things. The unfortunate nature of a lot of aircraft incidents is you're not really going to be around to care about it in a direct way, but your descendants might, or if you have family and assets, those could be of a concern. And if you think about the anatomy of a crash, like what's the anatomy of a crash? Kind of like if something truly bad happens, what's the anatomy of this civil litigation crash? What's it look like? Well, the unfortunate thing about it, is it's a you could call it a shotgun approach or a blanket approach or a wide net approach. You could use all those things and think about it. But when if something happens, everybody is going to become a defendant. Everyone. So if it's Cessna is going to become a defendant. The manufacturer of the engines is going to become a defendant. The manufacturer of the propeller and/or every component manufacturer is going to become a defendant. Everybody associated with the aircraft, including whoever performed maintenance on the aircraft, could be a defendant. The pilots could become defendants. Everybody could become a named defendant. And what ends up happening over time is that those defendants are dismissed over time as liability is determined and narrowed. It's like, so what actually happened? Who's actually at fault? Well, it might have been, it may be a failed compressor blade or something that was the result. Or if you think about I think it was the Sioux City crash a number of years ago, there was that turbine disc that severed the hydraulics. So, until that's known, you really don't know who's going to actually be considered at fault. But unfortunately with pilots, they're always going to start at pilots because what's the cause of most accidents? Pilot error. So you have to be aware of those things. So be aware of your insurance and potentially think about asset protection structures for your own assets. If you have assets, you may want to consider putting them in a trust or taking other estate planning measures to protect them. Those would be recommended, especially if you have children and family and things like that, and something to protect.
Right.
That's good advice. So what would you say, like, if you get your insurance policy and you listen to this podcast and you obtain your aircraft insurance policy, what sort of liability limit would you say that's not very much, or you'd say, that's sufficient? Like, what are just ballpark?
It really varies on the type of operation you're doing. So, for somebody out there flying like a Cessna 172, the liability limits you're going to see are about $1 million, which is really low. It's low.
Yeah.
If you're flying Part 91 for a company, you're probably going to want to see $25 million or more in liability coverage. And if you're flying Part 135, usually you're looking at 50 million or more, but a lot of the larger operators are 100 or 200 million in liability coverage. But yeah. I can tell you though, that it cuts both ways, because these days it's becoming harder and harder for operators to obtain insurance for their pilots because there's been a couple occurrences and then this is what's being told to the aviation industry by insurance brokers, but the Kobe Bryant crash and the 737 MAX crashes, all those kind of go to the same pool of underwriting coverage. So there were two major occurrences within a fairly recent time period that were multi-million dollar claims. Those went against the coverage pool. So now, admittedly, insurance companies, what are they really in the business of? They're in the business of collecting premiums. They're not in the business of paying claims. So you got to keep that in mind as well. But, 25 million, 50 million, if you're seeing a significant, if for example, going back to this Part 91 corporate arrangement, if you're seeing, like $10 million of coverage, but you're basically a corporate shuttle and you're taking a lot of employees around, a lot of family members, a lot of friends on golf outings, a lot of, ski trips and things like that with third parties, you might want to consider upping that coverage or at least revisiting the terms of coverage.
Yeah, it's funny, as I have all my insurance policies now open on my screen, scanning through the liability limits, and it's pretty funny.
Well, but the thing is, for 135 operators, I don't know offhand, off the top of my head, what the insurance requirements are, but they're so low they were set in the 70s, so the numbers don't even really apply anymore.
Oh my gosh!
But those are those are the regulatory minimums.
Well, and I think it's kind of one of those things too, where if you fly with a high net worth individual that has a lot of assets, normally the protections that if he's responsible, the protections he have in place are well in excess of what you would need. So those are the ones I feel like where you see, like a lot of the ones I've flown have $100 million liability.
That's pretty standard.
Right. But then you see like the kind of people that cut corners on maintenance and are always cheap about everything. Those are the ones where you might see the reduced liability limits. Or kind of like when you're a pilot and you have your own plane, and then you're writing the check for the insurance, then you're a little more sensitive to what the premium is, and therefore
sure. And you see people
the liability.
You see people self-insure every now and then.
Oh,
totally. No insurance whatsoever.
Yeah, on citation 10. Like I know people like this. It's crazy, and they just think of the whole loss. They're not thinking of the liability. I think a lot of times.
No, yeah. So be aware of it. Review those things. Just put it on your radar to check the insurance policy, essentially for whomever you work for. Just saying, I'd like to see a copy of it. Don't just go into it blindly, because, especially in the early phases of your time building phase of your career, a lot of those operators, they're going to cut corners because margins are thin.
Yeah.
Margins are thin, margins are thin throughout the industry, but they're really thin with smaller operators.
And one more question before we wrap up the insurance talk. If you're a pilot and you have a umbrella policy, would that, in your liability gets maxed out on whatever your aircraft insurance policy is, will then your umbrella policy typically absorb some of the liability as well?
Possibly, but I can't answer that with definity. Or
just depends on how it's written.
Absolutely. But what I would say though is that one of the things you might consider, you raise something I could interject, is that if you're working for like a charter company or 135 company, a lot of times, and this is standard language for most, but a lot of times there's language in their customer agreements that limit liability to the proceeds of insurance. So, for example, third-party charter customer comes, they fly on the flight, incident occurs, and then they sue the charter company. Their ability to recoup their losses should be limited to the proceeds of insurance. That's kind of standard, but you'd be surprised sometimes you don't find that. So, if again you're a pilot, you're not an insurance broker. You shouldn't have to be on the ball with regards to all these things, but just generally speaking, hey, check the terms and get an idea under what terms you're working under and how your company does business, because it's going to be important to you as a pilot with regards to how you're protected in the corporation and company you're with.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Any other thoughts? My last thought, and the reason I'm so hot on this is I was just in a recurrent training for the airplane that I fly, and the instructor was really hammering the importance of following the published procedures. Whenever there's any type of, if there's some type of abnormal or emergency, he says there's a lot of gravity beyond just following the procedure for the sake of the procedure in the airplane, but also from your liability side of like, listen, there are now with CVR and flight data recorders and everything else, like if you don't do what the book tells you to do, there could be a consequence, even if you make it safely on the ground and do everything right, but you damage a hangar while you're coming, it's just like, there's a lot there that I think it's good to remind people about the gravity of your decision sometimes.
Yeah, well, your the operating handbook that you have from the company becomes a basis, becomes a tool in defense, and it can cut both ways in litigation. If you followed it, it helps. If you didn't follow it, it's going to come up too, because all those things are going to be reviewed in the event of a significant crash or significant occurrence. So if you followed the company's standard operating procedures, it can help. Again, it can help. But oftentimes when something happens, there was something missed with regards to the standard operating procedures, and that can create a air of liability if they're not followed. So, we're talking kind of doom and gloom in some ways, and don't really want to do that necessarily. But you just have to be, you have to be mindful and aware of what's going on and how you're flying. There's a lot more going on than just flying, especially on the underlying business aspects of it, coverage, etc.
Yeah, no, I don't mean to scare anyone, but yeah, it really did give me more perspective of like, yes, like there's a lot on the line here, so just make sure you're being a professional. I guess that's what it boils down to. Yeah,
fly by the book.
Exactly.
Let's take a quick break to tell you about a friend of the show, Timothy P. Pope. Tim is a certified financial planner who specializes in helping professional pilots chart a smarter financial course. Whether you're focused on retirement, investment management, or strategic tax planning, Tim brings the tools and insight to help you make the most of your career and beyond. He's also the host of the Pilot's Portfolio podcast, where he breaks down real-world financial strategies designed specifically for pilots. Timothy P. Pope, helping professional pilots make the most out of life.
Max, for anything else on the angle for professional pilots before we jump over to a couple of the GA topics we wanted to hit?
Well, I think one that kind of segues into the GA stuff is that, Forrest, can you kind of talk to us about so you're an airline pilot, right? And we kind of, I think, can agree that the most protections and things are apparent when you're an airline pilot from a legal standpoint and everything else, right? With the ASAP program and legal representation and yada yada and unions and everything. But then if you go home from flying your professional airline job and then you hop in, say your Carbon Cub and you go fly around as a general aviation pilot, what kind of liability and crossover I'm being more not from a financial liability. We kind of talked about that, but more of how can you put your livelihood in danger by flying for fun? Because you're using the same ticket for both. So if you need to adhere to the same rigorous protocols in your private flying that you do in your commercial flying, and you need to be aware as well. The rules don't go away, and kind of by analogy, maybe even farther, that if you're flying a drone and you violate an FAR, that can put your pilot's license at risk. So, conversely, be careful when you're flying, flying for fun in your Carbon Cub. Follow the same protocol, get training, and remain proficient in both, because the skill sets of flying 737 are, a lot of the things are the same, but a lot of the things are not when you go into the GA environment. And I always think that it's probably more. You need to be more aware when you're flying the Cub than even the 737, because you're going to be flying into unique environments,
all the time. Kind of like Dylan, if he's flying Part 91, he's not flying into the same airports all the time. Probably similar ones, but not all the same all the time. There's unique, he's going to have to deal with unique approaches in unique circumstances with airports all the time. So just, again, stay on the ball. Don't become lax with regards to your flying. And then, on the mate, I could talk a long time about GA formalities and maintenance and things like that. But
one before that, can you think of another beyond aviation and maybe like some type of maritime license? Is there anyone that has a professional license that also uses it recreationally? We're in such a weird little corner where it's like no brain surgeon is doing surgery and then on the weekends is like, well, I'll just go out to relax, do a little surgery on the side or whatever, or it's we're in such a weird thing. I can only think of like a sailor or some type of ship captain is the only type of other,
I think that's a good point. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I can't think of anyone that, but makes their living. Makes their living flying, makes their living doing one thing and then turns around and has fun doing it on the weekends. But maybe like a professional golfer, but
yeah, maybe that's a good point. Yeah, some type of athlete, a truck driver, maybe using their CDL. I don't know, but anyway, I was just thinking about that. I'm like, we're in such a weird little corner of the professional space where we can do it for work and fun. But anyways.
Yeah. So talk to us about some of the things, that you see in that realm.
Well, one of on the maintenance is a huge issue all the time, but it's really a big issue with private owners and private in GA. And I hate to say this again, but you almost have to be, it's like the more you know, the more you know, the more you don't want to know, or the more you see, the more you become aware of them. You're like, oh my goodness, this is pretty crazy. But with small aircraft, if you own like, Cirrus or, 4-seater aircraft that you fly for fun, you really have to be aware of what's going on with your aircraft from a maintenance perspective. And you're responsible as an owner for the maintenance of your aircraft. And whether it's current or not. And there's all kinds of games that are played in the GA space associated with maintenance. And, your shade tree mechanic, aircraft mechanic, he may be really good. He may not. But you really have to be aware of that also, because, one of the old tricks with in GA was, hey, leave your logbooks with me. Leave your logbooks with me. I did your annual, leave your logbooks with me. Well, why don't I sign off your annual, when you come back? Why don't I sign off your previous annual when you come to me for your next annual? If you're following me on that one.
Yeah.
Because the, you wouldn't have signed it off. The mechanics hold the records and then they sign it off a year later. If something occurs, hey, I never signed off the annual. The annual was never signed off. So there's all kinds of stuff like that you have to be aware of. And I see things with maintenance frequently that cause me concern, especially on the corporate side of things. But be aware of that. Have a good. Probably the best thing to do is to get a second opinion. So if you're using somebody for a year or 2 or 3, that's great, and you have a good relationship with them, great. Take it somewhere else in year 4 or 5. If you continually own it, take it somewhere else, because they're going to find stuff that were glossed over by your prior mechanic every time.
Yes.
A second set of eyes is going to find something, and you're going to go, oh my gosh, I can't believe, Dave didn't find that. But it's just human nature, and that's the way that it works. You're going to have folks that get a second opinion, and you're going to get a better result in the long term. It doesn't mean you can't go back to your prior mechanic for most of the work, but definitely get a second opinion every now and then.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Well, and the thing with big airplanes, their work cards, there's no like people aren't writing logbook entries from scratch a lot of times, or it's a lot more defined. Where you look in the light airplane, I bought an airplane a few months ago, and I was doing my own inspection and logbook review and stuff, and I went through it. I printed out all the service bulletins to go through to make sure when the mandatory ones were complied with, and yada yada yada. But you look through all of the sign-offs too, and there's so much ambiguity. Like there's a service bulletin every time you change the oil, you have to clean out this thing, and so you should be, change the oil with 4 quarts and this oil filter part, whatever, and yada yada, and cleaned out this thing per service bulletin. Yet, well, that's like done like half of the time. You see,
Yep.
And so, every mechanic does stuff a little bit different. Every write-up for the same annual inspection is different. And there's so much ambiguity, and it's almost worse with smaller airplanes where you have people that don't have as much experience and knowledge of dealing with maintenance. And maintenance tracking and things like that that are doing the review, especially if it's just the aircraft owner at the end of the day is flying it around and responsible that those ADs are complied with and mandatory service bulletins for the propeller and the engine and the airframe and all of the other stuff. That's taken me freaking 20 years to learn and figure it out, and I'm not even don't have it all figured out.
Yeah, the to your point, there's a lot of times where aircraft owners, or you kind of, I guess I would call them like the doctors and lawyers. They get into it and they go, oh, I'm a pilot now. I'm going to go buy a plane. They go buy a plane. It looks good. They're not mechanically inclined at all. They're not really following it at all. They're relying on the shop to do it. And those aircraft always have issues. And a lot of times I get calls from owners because they don't like, what they acquired or bought, the used space. But I'm still thinking about what Dylan said, like what other space, I don't know, like in aviation, there's like a million different ways to stub your toe. You can stub your toe in so many ways.
I think we just got the episode title. Thank you for doing that for us. Great.
Don't stub your toe.
To stub your toe.
I'm feeling so much better about my recreational flying at this point.
Let her rip. That's what Forrest says.
Well, but the thing is the truth is that every time you fly, or every time most of the time, every time you fly, in almost all circumstances, you're going to violate some rule somewhere. So it's just a matter of it's a matter of mitigating risk. It's a matter of doing the best you can, and having a good attitude about it is key. Because as soon as you think you know everything, you turn around and you find out that you didn't know anything.
Well, it circles back to the beginning of our conversation, Forrest, which I really love, which is the way where you're like, look, talk to the FAA. Maybe I'll help in the background and coach you, but I feel like that's not what I expected to hear, and that's refreshing because I feel like that makes sense intuitively. Like, look, in my interactions and hearing from other people, it has been they're more into educating than hitting you over the head with the hammer. But back to your point, like every flight that we do, if somebody really wants to find something, they probably can.
Yeah, if somebody wants to find something, they can. And I think a lot of it, if I don't know, it goes, that I don't know that old saying, pride comes before a fall kind of thing. It's like if you're overly proud about it, that's not a good attitude to have. If you're receptive to information, you always have to have your mouth closed and the ears open is really the way to approach it.
All right. Well, just real quick too, with the explosion of kind of these backcountry flying on YouTube that then has got everybody excited about it. Do you see a lot of, legal issues arise from people landing like off airport or in the backcountry, and, whether landing on the wrong types of land and getting in trouble, or careless and reckless for people water skiing on lakes now and all this crazy stuff that you see? Do you see stuff like that come across your desk much?
I'm not seeing much of that come across my desk. However, that doesn't mean it's not out there. But I think that, I think you guys raised or read about Trent Palmer, and I saw that, and or I kind of saw that in the periphery. I remember when that kind of came up initially, and it was kind of a big deal because he's big in YouTube, social media, etc. And going back to the FAA and kind of how the FAA operates, if you look at the Trent Palmer situation, he's out there flying on unimproved strips and things like that, and special rules apply. And I guess I don't know, if you're on social media, you're going to have a high level of scrutiny. You're going to provide the evidence to the FAA. So if you make a misstep anywhere, they're going to find it. So if you're going to fly in the public eye, you got to be careful. But Max, I know you said you kind of followed this throughout, which I did not.
It's just interesting because he ended up he was flying at somebody's private airstrip, a friend of his. He did a low pass as an inspection pass. He didn't like the conditions, and so he did a go around or a low pass, and then departed the area. Well, somebody caught him on surveillance camera video, and they complained, and they said that they buzzed the house, right? And so obviously the rules say you have to be 500 feet away from persons, people or property or whatever, unless for takeoff and landing, right? Well, he's like, well, the FAA basically said, well, you didn't land, so you were within 500 feet of someone's house. So, and they violated him for that. And he, pushed back and found even in advisory circulars that say, it's wise in a backcountry airport to do a low inspection pass. And then before you land to make sure there's, the runway's cleared, yada, yada, yada. And even still, it didn't stick. And he got a suspension and appealed it, and it stuck. And so I guess for me, it really, you look at that, it was interesting because first he called and I think he, in retrospect, he regretted saying some of the things he said in his initial response.
Yeah.
Wished if he knew now what he knew then, he would have, probably hit the brakes earlier and called in for professional help once he saw it going the direction it was going, and they weren't messing around.
No, and I think it probably has a lot to do with his public persona at the time. Because think about this: FAA inspectors would be paid at their desk to watch YouTube videos associated with aviation because it's work related.
Yeah.
They're all following this stuff. So with regards to I think I watched his kind of recap of what occurred, and it was struck me because that's truly how the FAA operates, at least, and especially when things get more formal. I can tell you that it becomes a strategy of mitigating the the fine or the suspension or whatever, or revocation,
Right.
or 407 ride. It becomes it becomes an exercise in mitigation. You're almost never going to get off completely once they start escalating that formality, because it's kind of guilty until proven innocent, and it's almost impossible to prove yourself completely innocent, despite the circumstances. So even in this circumstance where there was even in Trent Palmer's circumstance where it appeared as though he had a rational reason for flying the way he did, which made sense from a safety perspective, it didn't necessarily comport with how close he was to a residence or a building. Flew 500 feet away, and that became the reason for the citation for careless and reckless flight. Which, was his flight careless or reckless? I don't believe so. That's definitely arguable, but you got to be aware of these things.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of, remember when Harrison Ford had a couple issues, and then I think he ended up landing on a taxiway.
Yeah,
I don't remember. Didn't he have to make an educational video? And there's just a heightened sense, to your point, of if you're in the public eye.
That's a good question. I'm going to look up and see what happened to Harrison Ford, because Harrison Ford had a runway incursion. It was more serious than doing a low pass to check a runway. It was caught on video too. So that kind of goes back to maybe kind of the pun is if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, did it really make a noise? I don't know.
Well, now with ADS-B and Ring doorbell cameras
and
and
everyone
everyone
wants
cell
to
phone,
be a
everybody
YouTube
it's
star
always
and an
heard now.
influencer.
It's
Yeah.
always, that's the thing, is it's always, I agree, it's always heard now. So you have to operate under the premise that it's going to be seen. And I don't know, flying around with your GoPro mounted, taping everything you do. I don't know if there's reasons to do that, and there's reasons not to do that. You kind of create your own problems sometimes. But going back to Trent, that's really the way the FAA escalates things. And if they get entrenched at the administrative law judge level with regards to a position, it's really hard to overturn that, especially when it comes to flights.
I really got what I learned from that whole thing is they really were going to get their pound of flesh, dude. No matter kind of what happened there, and it's made me. It was a good. I'm glad he put it out there and described it, because it was helpful. It's changed the way I think sometimes, because I'm very very cautious about how high I'm flying over anything, and very very conscious of making sure to stay away from those things, because it's so easy to catch you now. It's so easy for people to call and find you on open ADS-B or whatever.
Sure. I think about it because you see an aircraft fly. This is in Florida, close to where I am. If you go to the beach, you see aircraft doing low flights along the beach all the time. And sometimes you see them and you're like, I know they're not 500 feet above the ground. And I know that they're probably being taped as well.
Yeah.
So,
right. So
everybody's got a video camera in their pocket.
And to your point, one last thing that we've been getting some emails on from the MBAA AOPA side is, they're really trying to reverse or change the way the ADS-B data is used, because they had said, look, the intention of ADS-B was for safety. And now it's starting to be used for enforcement. You've got companies that are using it to collect landing fees. There's like a lot of unintended consequences there. It seems to me like it's a how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube kind of a situation. Do you think there's any chance that the ADS-B data won't be used for enforcement in the future? Like, I just don't know how they would not be able to do that.
I don't think that there's any way to. I like your analogy. I don't think there's any way to do that. To put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah, I mean,
there's once it's out there, they're going to use it. Whatever information's available, and there's a whole issue with sales and use tax on aircraft, and they're using flight tracking software like FlightAware, ADS-B, whatever information they can to demonstrate and show that an aircraft has been within it's been where it was.
Yep. Yeah. The good old days are over.
Yep.
The good old days are over. Kind of like now, just, in social circumstances, it's the same thing. It's like, I can't believe that's on social media. 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been. Nobody would have even known about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Crazy.
Well, Forrest, I know we could keep this conversation going for hours on end, and I expect listeners will have some questions for you. So we'll encourage them to write in to the show, and we'll maybe do some follow up with you. I know you're located in Florida. Can you help pilots that are not in Florida, or how does that work? Can you work nationwide, or do you have to talk to somebody local?
You can work nationwide because it's federal.
Okay.
So everything with airman certification is federal. I am located in Florida, but it's all federal. So we deal with airman matters throughout the country. So there's no issue with that. You're not jurisdictionally precluded from representing airmen before the FAA or NTSB. So, but if anybody wants to reach me, they can reach me via email's best. Forrest, Forrest at aviationlegalcounsel.com or 888-635-9529. Or another way to remember it is 888-6-FLYLAW. So
Fly
any of
law.
those,
Love it. All right.
any of those ways, any of those ways to
We'll
reach
have
me.
all that in the show notes, so folks can reach out and get help if they need it.
Coaching,
exactly.
Yeah, I mean it's funny how many it's like, and it doesn't pay my light bills, but that's okay. But but I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with pilots, just kind of talking them off the ledge when it comes to dealing with the FAA and coaching them through an appropriate and appropriate and measured response to the inquiry. In closing, and I know our time's wrapping up, but just if you can think of anything, just don't try to solve the problem too quickly. Because if you try to solve it too quickly, it will only make it worse.
And we'll leave it with that. Thanks very much for coming on the show, Forrest. We really appreciate your time and insight.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. And I appreciate my client introducing me to your podcast. I'll be listening to more episodes now and in the future.
Hey, we will not be liable if you fall asleep while driving, so don't listen while driving.
The statements made in this show are our own opinions and do not reflect, nor were they under any direction from any of our employers.